Hey guys, it's Neffy. How y'all doing? I'm gonna give you guys a couple seconds, as is the custom, for y'all to come in. All right. So today I'm gonna do a book review on the Black Man's Religion. It's subtitled "Can Christianity Be Afrocentric?" Oh my God, this book, baby. The last book that I did was How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. This book right here, I could not put this book down. Like, if I were to emphasize to you the one book that you need to get to do urban apologetics, or even to just be interested, to show interest in Christianity and Africa and the black man and the plight of African Americans and racial injustice and the Bible and all of those things, this is the book. And I don't know if y'all can see this because I think it flips it, but I don't remember how much I paid for this on Amazon, but somewhere this was $2. I don't think I paid $2. Somebody got me. You know what I'm saying? At the same time, there are bookstores, used bookstores that you can go to and grab a copy of this. As a matter of fact, after I ordered this on Amazon, I went to the library to pick up some more books, and this was in the library. Again, this is Black Man's Religion, Can Christianity Be Afrocentric by Glenn Usry and Craig Keener. The book, so whenever I read a book, I start off from the very beginning. I want to see everything the author has to say, right? And so even from the preface, I was just like, oh my gosh, like it was just so captivating just to have such a balanced and honest perspective coming from. So first of all, this may turn some people off, but I'm going to keep it real with you 100%. Glenn Usry, I believe, so this book is written by two different individuals. One of them is African American and the other one is European American. And they tell you the story about how the two came together and how they came to write the book and all of that stuff at the end in the last chapter. But my heart is still throbbing from reading this book. So I'm going to give you a preview, a little taste, and tell you why I'm so in love with this book. And I'm going to go section by section. So in the preface, they start talking, they're going to give you like an overview of what the book is supposed to be telling you about, right? And a breakdown of each section. And so just reading that and getting my appetite whet by what it was that I was getting prepared to read was really good. They did a really good job on the preface. So chapter 1, I'm going to tell you the titles of the 6 chapters of this book. Chapter 1 is Why History Belongs to Us. Chapter 2 is Back to Africa, Geographical Identification. 3 is Black is Still Beautiful, Identification by Color. Chapter 4 is Was Egypt or Israel Black? Baby, do you hear the titles? I'm telling you, you need to get a copy of this book. Number 5 is God of Our Weary Years, Identification on the Basis of Common Oppression. I said identification on the basis of common oppression. Honey, wait, just give me a second. We're going to get there. And then chapter 6 is called Militant Christianity, Justice Through Reconciliation. All right. So chapter 1, once again, is Why History Belongs to Us. And then they basically say, the first thing that they say is, in response to objections that Christianity is a white man's religion, we affirm that it is also a black man's religion. That is the preface for the entire book. Like, that's what they're arguing that. That's why it's called Black Man's Religion. No, this is not, what's the name again? The name is Black Man's Religion. Can Christianity be Afrocentric? Okay. So the first thing they do is tell us why it's important and what they're not saying. They're not saying that everything and every single person in the Bible was black. Just to see that coming from an African American perspective, for people who are just not trying to blackwash, we typically hear the term whitewash. They're not trying to blackwash Christianity, and it's just so refreshing. So they basically said this is not advocating impractical separatism. We are not claiming that all of the heritage and all of the history of the Bible belongs to Africans. We are simply saying that we feel that African Americans should be given their proper due credit for their contributions, not only to history, but to biblical work. So the other book I did before, once again, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, is basically dealing with the Bible and Christianity and how it was formulated by African influence afterwards. This is saying that people in the Bible were black, and how to deal with Christianity from an African American perspective, how Christianity has influenced America. So the basis for identification. So I'm going to share, like I said, this is just a disclaimer. Whenever I do a book review, I like to respect the author's attempt to sell his book, right? So I'm not going to give away everything, but I'm going to give you some highlights that, whet your appetite for you to get the book too. So the basis for identification, one section that I have highlighted here is when we see black skin, we identify with one another as sharers in the same community of experience, whatever shade of black our skin is. So me being on the lighter side of the spectrum, people, African Americans, and those who aren't African American, as a matter of fact, would still identify me as a black person. I see another black person. You ever go somewhere, right, where there's not a lot of black people, and you see another black person in the room, and you just feel an instant connection? It's just like, yeah, we family. So basically, that's what they're saying here. He's saying that a deeper characteristic of our identity, deeper than our pigment, is our experience. As being a part of the black community, a heritage that has usually included a simple dignity in the face of oppression. So what he's saying here is what it means to be black is deeper than just a skin color. What it means to be black in America is we are brothers in the same struggle. We face the same oppression. It says that we have had, so then they started talking about, so again, chapter 1 is entitled Why History Belongs to Us. So he talks about black history in America, and he's saying that only in recent decades has the black family been devastated on a wide scale. This devastation has reflected social trends that have hit the ghettos the hardest, but it certainly does not reflect our historic values. Rather, it reflects the widespread impact of modern secular American values of placing the self before community, as well as sexual and drug crises originally spawned by white free thinkers in the universities in the 60s. So if you're unfamiliar with what has happened to African Americans and why we are in the condition that we're in. So they don't entirely place the blame on the white community or outside of the black community. But what they're saying is a fire was sparked. And then we as African Americans fanned that fire. And that fire was, so there's books out there that talk about how drugs have intentionally been placed in the African American community. There's books that claim that the CIA, as a matter of fact, I can't remember the title of the book, but there was a guy who wrote a book about how the CIA brought drugs into the community, and it was basically like a big thing, kind of like how COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, came out and they found out, okay, when the civil rights leaders of the 60s were saying that they were being targeted by the FBI, it wasn't just some conspiracy. They found government documents saying this is what you need to do to dismantle these organizations. And so that gave credence to what people were saying in terms of like feeling that they were being targeted. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact. And so what he's saying here is, it is a fact that we have had certain things that were intentionally done to African Americans to put them in the plight that they're in. But he's not saying that, he's saying that that's not indicative of our cultural or historical values. So if you see single parent households or if you see broken families, it's not because African Americans are inherently broken. It's because we have suffered these things as a result of systemic abuse. So he's saying that, and then one of the closing thoughts in chapter 1 says that in light of the various positions on such issues that now exist among us, it may almost be presumptuous anymore to call something a black thing. And so he goes into the identification of what it means to be black. And I think that's a very important conversation because I talk to a lot of different people, and a lot of times me being as vocal as I am about my Christianity and as vocal and unapologetic as I am about being black, those two things seem to contradict each other in this day and age. Like, how can you be woke or how can you be concerned about the plight of the black man if you're also a Christian? And then I'll have people come to me and say, well, we should unite on those things that we find common. And what they mean is put race first and worry about the issues that the race faces. But then, well, how do we even do that? How do we really truly connect with one another if, one, we can't really agree on who our enemy is, because I believe my enemy to be spiritual, not negating that European Americans or Europeans in general have been used by that spiritual enemy. You will never hear me say white supremacy or racism does not exist. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, how do we fight that if you and I can't see eye to eye on who the true enemy really is? And so when we look at post-Reconstruction era, and we look at people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass and Marcus Garvey, and we look at them and what their philosophies were, they often butted heads. But we would call them all leaders, but they butt heads, and they were almost enemies. You know what I mean? They were almost enemies when it came down to what they believed we needed as a people to be able to move forward. Should we get reparations? Should we seek that? Should we depend on welfare? Should we try to be independent? Should we do segregation or separation? All of those things become divisive issues. So what he's saying here is, how do you say what's black? How do you define something as being a black thing when black people don't even agree on what we should be doing? And so I said that to say, how can we move forward excluding and putting religion to the side, as they say, if we can't agree on those things? So I found that very moving. Back to Africa is chapter 2. Back to Africa, again, for those of you who are just joining, we're doing a review on Black man's religion. Can Christianity be Afrocentric? Chapter 2 is Back to Africa, geographical identification. Now, I put a post up earlier saying that I had a discussion with a Black Hebrew Israelite, and I told them, people have this imagination that white people are evil, as if white people aren't human, as if you in the same circumstances may not have done the same things that they did. And one telling example of this to me in history is the Holocaust. Now, I'm not going to get into because people try to into with you about whether the Holocaust happened. The Holocaust happened. Some people out there try to say the Holocaust never happened. Forget all that. But what I learned in studying the Holocaust was that you would have Germans who weren't Jews, who were your neighbors, right? And y'all were down for years, 20 years. You coming over my house, I'm going over your house. We work together, we share together, all that, right? And then as Hitler puts this notion that I'm better than you out there, I never thought of myself as better than you before. But now that this idea is being pushed by the government and I start to accept that, now I start to see it. I start to see myself as better than you, and I start to see you as less than human. And so what I'm saying is, people in certain circumstances allow their depravity to show in ways they might not have shown if they weren't in those circumstances. But the depravity is still there. So what does it mean here that Europeans behave just like those uncivilized Africans just as soon as they are released from communist colonialism, except that when Europeans engage in warfare, it is called the struggle for democracy. So Europeans will look down on Africans and say, well, you have intertribal wars. Well, hold on now. Wait a minute now. Because Europeans also had intertribal wars, but they had their wars. They had their wars with people that they considered barbarians, but they were still European tribes. So the behavior is the same. It's just the behavior is the same. The sentiment is the same. It's just that we give it different labels depending on who is committing the acts. Africa's history and Europe's history. So this is a really good, chapter 2 is really good because it talks about a basic history of what people have done to show themselves the same. So can people who often abandon babies following the ancient Roman custom condemn Africans for the much rarer practice of twin murder? Again, he's basically showing like we're all the same. We all commit the same sins. We just call it different. In the early 1800s, a British Quaker reported with horror that he had found British agents ripping off Indian women's breast nipples and practicing other forms of torture to acquire money for the British government. Later in the century, British officials jailed educated Africans for proposing self-government in the Gold Coast. So as we know, things are typically characterized as crime depending on who the most vocal party is. So for example, we have a lot of people sitting in jail right now for having sold marijuana, right? For the trafficking of marijuana. And yet, all along the West Coast, we have people who are starting to make millions of dollars off of this same industry, but because now it's legal, it's okay. It's the same behavior, it's just classified differently because of the parties that are involved. So he goes into a detailed history. I highlighted all up in this thing because it was just, when I read a book, If there's anything of interest to me, I'm going to highlight it. If there's anything that's new to me, I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to look it up. And so what I try to tell people, and I'm sorry if this sounds very elementary to you, but I try to cater to my entire audience. So you'll see here that there will be like citations for footnotes or endnotes. In the book, it's in the end, the endnotes. So when I see this, I'm going to go and actually either try to look up this endnote and find out what it is they're talking about, if the original source actually says that, if they've applied their own interpretation to it. I want to see where they're getting their information from, especially as it relates to history, because if it's history, then I should be able to verify it for myself. So it talks about Africa's empires, and it says that anciently the Europeans actually had a higher amount of respect for Africans, talking about how Greek writers would call them beautiful and intelligent and all these different things. And it basically gives you a history of ancient West Africa and its ancient Africa period and its association with the non-African world. Northeast African kingdoms and Christian history, it talks about the Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, had sent missionaries eastward. There is now solid evidence that these missionaries established churches in China, and probably traveled as far as Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia by the 9th century. And so it talks about how Christianity was initially seen as a threat by certain governments because of the unity that it spread and it's a revolution, the downright revolutionary nature of it. Christianity spread in Egypt so strongly that the nation remained a majority Christian nation into the 10th century. So a lot of people try to disassociate Christianity from Egypt, but there were a lot of Egyptian Christians who some of them became martyrs. It also talks about Islam, and it gives you a backstory of Islam and Christianity and their interactions in Africa and how Islam was spread. Let me see if I can find the Christian period. Okay, so it talks about Nubia and its Christianity, and it says that the Christian period of Nubia also introduced a separation between church and state. So we typically think of that as like a European ideal, but here it is in Nubia, Christian Africans practicing a separation between secular and religious affairs. We don't get credit for that. And that's what the aim of the book is, to give us credit where credit is due, not to snatch undue credit from someone else, and not to allow our credit to be given away, right? Okay, so I don't want to read, like I said, I highlighted a lot of stuff. I don't want to read the whole chapter to you, but you need to buy this book. Once again, The Black Man's Religion. Why I like this point here too, because it's hard for us to think of things abstractly when we've been taught from the beginning how to define certain things, right? So, for example, here he's talking about Arabia could be viewed as part of Asia and Egypt as part of Africa. Yet the ancient inhabitants of South Arabia were ethnically closer to East Africans than to, say, East Asians. So what does that mean? That means that we've been taught to think of Arabian peoples as Asian when historically or anciently speaking, they may have been considered African. And then he says, why are Europe and Asia separate continents? There is no landmass separating them. There is no body of water that truly separates them. So why are they considered separate continents? And then he says, perhaps it's simply because earlier Europeans loathed to associate themselves with the culturally distinct peoples of Asia, wanted Asia on a separate continent when they drew up the map. It's that simple. It's that simple. The reason why we disassociate them is because on a map that somebody drew, they're on two separate continents. But in reality, it's one landmass. And it says that Europeans drew the maps that are used today, and they drew them for their own cultural purposes. There is nothing sacred about the boundaries of the continents that are currently divided. So what is he saying here? He's saying that, yeah, it's on a map and there's lines on the map, but when I cross from the Florida to Georgia border, there ain't no line for me to cross for real. It's an imaginary line. It's an imaginary line that was drawn up by people who had an agenda, and it suited their agenda very well, very well. And I think that I was talking to somebody in a group that's called Conversations with White People, and it's about race and how to talk to people. It's a really good group if you want to join it. The people there are really laid back. The European Americans are really laid back. They'll answer your questions, and it's an opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue. So today I was asking the same question that I asked on my page: do you think white people would leave the church if they found out that Jesus was not as non-white? Because they'll acquiesce to the fact that he wasn't white, but they'll say that he's olive colored. What is olive colored? What does that mean? And then when we look at our media, when we look at the media and the media portrayals of Jesus, he's a tan white man. Come on now, let's keep it real now. He's a tan white man. All these little cartoons, he's a tan white man. And so what does it really mean to a white person to say, I accept the fact that Jesus isn't white? If in all of your iconography, he's still basically white. He's still basically white. So I asked that question, and basically in the course of that conversation, a lady said to me, or maybe they make him look Italian. And then I was like, well, isn't Italian white? And she was Italian, so she was like, no, he's not white. I'm Mediterranean. So me personally, I respect somebody's identification. If you want to identify as non-white, even though you white, who am I to tell you you ain't white or you are white? If you don't want to be white, that's fine. Even though it's clear as day to me that you are, in your mind, you're not white. If people can call, what's his name? What's this guy? Bruce Jenner. If they can call him Caitlyn, I can let you call yourself white. I will respect your decision. At the end of the day, though, in the back of my mind, you white. And the reason why that is because I have this idea. We all know that race is a social construct, meaning that it's completely made up. It's, as my sister would say, it's fugazi. Okay, it's fugazi. But nevertheless, these are the roles that we've been assigned, and so we continue to operate within them. So that was chapter 2. Again, it's a backstory of Africa. Now here, chapter 3, Black is Still Beautiful, Identification by Color. Oh, man. To explain why identification on the basis of race is important to us, we must survey briefly the history of race in U.S. society. We must examine, if we're going to discuss race in history, we'll talk about the color of the ancient peoples. But he's saying that are race and color inextricably linked? Now, I think that's a deep question. I think that's a profound question. Is race really truly based on color? Here in the United States, we had that one drop rule. If we knew that one of your ancestors were black, baby, you black, right? And you were treated as black. Not only were you called black, but being called black wasn't just a title. It wasn't just a title. It was an identification of where you belonged in society. So African Americans, we aren't typically taught about race relations in other nations and other cultures. And I find that because I teach high school as well, and when I find that my high school students are ignorant to the fact that you can be black and Colombian or black and Honduran, it further highlights that fact that we are very self-centered. We're American-centered, right? So here in America, if somebody has a black ancestor, you automatically black. But in another country, for example, Mexico, they have various levels and degrees of blackness or whiteness. And then they also include their natives in that scheme. We don't have very many natives left because America has decimated these people, but they include the natives in their scheme. So for example, if you have one parent who's black and one parent who's native, you might be called a mestizo. You might be called different degrees of whatever combination that is. So what does it mean to be black here in America? Well, it's a very thorough and detailed analysis of how we came to view ourselves as black versus white here in America. He talks about interracial marriages and how they were forbidden and why they were forbidden. The book talks about let's see, let me give you a quote here. In 1896, there were over 130,000 African-American voters in Louisiana, but just 8 years later, the same state had only 1% of that figure. The basis for disenfranchisement was color. So here again, race is not just a cultural identification, but a political one. I think that's a very important point to highlight, to acknowledge that it's a political tool or a tool against you or for you, however you want to use it, but they will identify you on the basis of race and then exclude you for certain things. Impoverished life in urban ghetto does not keep people from feeling, from loving, from hoping, but it does limit their options and horizons and ultimately shape their character and destiny if they never encounter a realistic alternative to the role models it presents as normative. So he's saying that just because you're born in the ghetto, or hey, LaShawn, just because you're raised in the ghetto doesn't mean that you're going to turn out a certain way, but it does have a tendency to produce certain behaviors in people. 86% of white suburban Americans live in neighborhoods that are less than 1% black. These are just facts that I'm spitting to you, but from the book, because again, I want to respect the author and to let you go ahead and buy this book yourself. Once again, for those of you just joining, Black Man. Okay. So it talks about here slavery, lessons of color and beyond color. So it talks about how not just Arab, but color does not necessarily guarantee unity. Even for us, just as freed slaves in the Roman Empire acquired slaves whenever they could, some slaves in the United States, once freed, acquired slaves, despite the much worse conditions to which American slaves were generally subjected. And that's something that's not a popular opinion or a popular fact that's often shared. But we have to be honest, right? And if we're going to be honest, we're going to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, correct? So it's saying that evidence, this is page 53. It says, evidence also suggests that most black slaveholders treated their slaves the same way white slaveholders did. Some were kind, but most treated them as chattel property. So what he's doing here is challenging this identification of blackness and you being my brother because of the color of my skin, and how vain that really is, and how people don't really truly stick to that. Like they'll tell me, for example, people will tell you that they see you as one with them, but then when they find out how serious you are about your Christianity, they'll disown you, or they'll write you off as a coon or whatever the case is. So that basically shows that your love for me is not truly based on the color of my skin. It's based on the color of my skin in conjunction with how well you and I agree on certain issues. Racial identification, is it useful? Greek historian Herodotus described a tribe of Africans as the handsomest men in the world. U.S. slave codes always treated Africans as black. So that chapter is telling you about the political identification of blackness and what that means. Chapter 4, baby, for all my BHIs, we have this discussion frequently. Was Egypt or Israel black? I'm telling you, you need to get this book. In some periods of Egypt's history, explicitly Nubian pharaohs sat on the throne. I'm going to just give you an overview. This chapter is basically telling you that according to United States definition of black, which is not a universal definition, that one drop rule is not universal. That's something that they did here to institute segregation and to continue their system of being able to profit off of slavery. But that's not necessarily a universal definition. So that's why I think that plays a role in why, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. I'm sorry. I think that plays a role in why certain peoples will not identify themselves as black, and we get offended. We be like, hold on, what you mean you're not black? You darker than me. For example, I hate to use the stereotype of Dominicans, but a lot of times Dominicans do not identify themselves as black, but they may identify as African, and they see those as two different things because being black has this stigma in the United States that it carries over into other nations, such that they don't want to associate themselves as being black. It says the curse of Ham, honey. The curse of Ham was a post-biblical myth borrowed from Islam and especially developed by white supremacists in Europe, then by their successors in the United States and among the Boers in South Africa. It says the curse of Ham was a post-biblical myth. First of all, if you actually read the Bible, you know that the curse wasn't actually on Ham himself, right? But he's basically saying that the definition of what the curse supposedly applied to was made up post-Bible and then applied to Africans to justify our enslavement. And it was initially done by the Arabs, by Islam. And then it was developed and basically honed more by Europeans, white supremacists in Europe, who even went to the extent of creating sciences, so-called science, to justify their treatment of Africans as subhuman, saying that God himself had given them that right. Christian Afrocentric Bible writers are correct that the curse of Canaan was fulfilled in the time of Joshua and his successors and ceased to be applicable later as the descendants of Canaanites assimilated to other peoples. We'll never hear that. We don't never hear that the curse of Canaan, not the curse of Ham, has already been fulfilled before the Bible was even finished, before Jesus ever came. No, we're here being told that the curse of Ham is either black skin or slavery, perpetual slavery for black people. But we don't hear about these other theories. Now he also gives a caution. Remember, the chapter of this title is Was Egypt or Israel Black? And he also gives a word of caution of saying, listen, y'all Afrocentric people, I understand what y'all trying to do. He doesn't say Hotez because this was written a while ago. But I understand what you're trying to do in correcting the wrongs that have been done in terms of writing us out of history. But don't go in the opposite extreme and make yourself lose credibility because you're trying to paint everything black. And that was my issue with the Hidden Colors series. Like, I feel like they just went overreaching and just defined everything as black and then pushed for certain levels of separatism that I can't vibe with. They go to an excess and they lose their credibility. When the Israelites were subjected to slavery under Egyptians, they had former servants with them, and they were all identified as Israel together. This means that much intermarriage must have taken place. He's talking about when Israel first went in to Egypt under Joseph, they had servants with them, and lots of intermarriage took place during that time, throughout those 400 years of their bondage in Egypt, such that when they came out, we also know that some of the Egyptians came out with them and there was a mixed multitude. But what he's saying here is that God's people has always included, the term Israel has always included a variety of shades and a variety of peoples. So if, for example, Abraham had an Egyptian servant, he had more than one. I'm sure she wasn't the only one. He had hundreds of servants with him. All of these people, once they went into Egypt, were termed what? They were termed Israel. They were included in the identification of Israel. So he also talks about, this was a deep statement to me. He said, whereas Rome is mentioned about 20 times, Greece 26 times in the Bible, Ethiopia appears 40 times, and Egypt over 700 times. For those who claim Rome for the heritage of Europe as a continent, though it ruled more territory in North Africa and Northern Europe, while rejecting Egypt as a part of Africa, we should note that Northern Europe appears nowhere in the Bible. Northern Europe appears nowhere in the Bible. So for the Christianity to be a white man's religion, the main places that were ruled, if this girl says, if the girl I was talking to earlier says Italy was Mediterranean, right, then it wasn't necessarily a European or white people ever. It was a grouping of different types of people together. It says here that once black Christians were released from slavery, we were among the first people to recognize the importance of sharing the gospel of hope to all people. Long before Europe sent missionaries or even responded to the gospel, 3 African missionaries from Egypt were martyred for their witness in Switzerland. Africans in Switzerland proclaiming the gospel, being martyred. So just as an aside, so they give you basically a good understanding of what race, because we know race is once again a social construct of recent invention. It wasn't always how people were classified. And so he talks about like, okay, well, if you're going to say that they were black, it's because of the one drop rule that we use here in the United States. If we're going to apply that historically, then yes. If we're applying the one drop rule, then yes, all of Egypt was black. If we're applying the one drop rule, then yes, all of Israel was black. But we can't really apply the one drop rule because that's a phenomenon that takes place here within the confines of the American mentality. It did not exist anciently. And because of that, he says that the Egyptians, for example, may have been lighter in skin color than the Nubians to their south, but they were definitely darker than the Europeans to their north. So where does that put them in the spectrum of race? Were they truly black? Maybe, maybe not, depending on how you define race. I don't want to keep you here all day, so I'm going to go on to chapter 5. Chapter 5, God of our weary years. Identification on the basis of common oppression. I put a post up maybe a year or so ago, and it said, I just wanted to clarify for you that I am not just pro-black, I am pro-oppressed peoples. Because we all share a common struggle. People who are oppressed share a common struggle, and it's a counterproductive ideology to identify only with the victims of oppression who look like me, when there are people who don't look like me who are suffering in the same way I am. And so if we faction ourselves off into these different groups based on cultural identity instead of on common experience, then we do ourselves a disservice. We do the struggle a disservice because we are not truly united, whereas it looks like there are many, many different pieces. We're all really just one large piece and we could work together and affect more change. And so he says here, the broader approach of identifying with the oppressed in general also provides a practical basis for cooperating to achieve justice, helping us combat racism in a society that is impatient with racially specific claims. So, for example, I taught African American history at a high school, and one of my students is pushing to make African American history a requirement for all Florida high school graduates. So if you graduate from a Florida school, you should be required to take African American history. And we can talk about that later. I don't want to hold you up. But when you start talking about let's make Black history a requirement, people start coming out of woodworks. Well, we need to make Hispanic American history a requirement. We need to make Japanese American history a requirement. We need to make sure people get in all these different classes, and we want all this inclusion and all this stuff. But the African American experience is, and so basically the African American experience, yes, is unique in terms of how we got here, but it is not unique in terms of how we struggled. And so a lot of people are ignorant to just what has happened to other cultures. I was watching a PBS documentary on Geronimo, the Native American, one of the last standing Native Americans. And looking at the timeline of when he was fighting the struggle for Native Americans, this is the 1870s. This is like post-emancipation. I understand there were still people that were being enslaved, but post-emancipation. So we over here celebrating our freedom, and we still got Native American brethren who are being wiped out for their land. Historically or anciently, I used to think that historically reservations was like a sign of respect, right? I mean, granted, Europeans came over here and took the land from Native Americans, and I felt like reservations were a token of respect, apology. No, reservations. They were forced onto reservations in order to keep an eye on them and to keep them from fighting back. It wasn't, oh, here's a peace treaty. Let me give you this little piece of land to show you I got some respect for your heritage. It wasn't none of that. It was, let me supervise you on this piece of land. So what I'm saying is, during these times, we are often ignorant to what other people are going through, and they're going through the same or similar struggles that we have. We have had African Americans in the United States who have been sterilized without their knowledge. These are things that you can look up. Who have been sterilized without their consent. Women who are on the birthing table in the hospital saying, here, sign this, and they don't know what they're signing. That's duress. You're not supposed to make somebody sign something when they're not in their right mind. Anyone who's been in labor knows that's a duress type of situation. But we also have women who undergoing forced sterilization in Puerto Rico. We also have women who don't speak English, who emigrated to the United States, undergoing forced sterilization without their knowledge. So if I was to fight forced sterilization only from an African American perspective, I am leaving out all these other people who are also suffering from the same thing. How much greater would my impact be if we all united on that same front? So it makes a really good argument. And then it talks about racism in Islam, which is something that people don't typically talk about. He talks about how Farrakhan basically created this myth that Islam historically was never racist. Now, they may not have been racist in their doctrine, in their books, but in their behavior, they enslaved African Americans. Africans as well. They had, it says here, stereotypes about the sexual prowess or promiscuity, same things that we hear about African Americans, sexual promiscuity that Africans may have had. And he makes a point, like, it's really funny that you would call an African slave somebody who is has a high sexual appetite, but you're using this person to basically satisfy your sexual desires. So they're basically sex slaves, and then you pin it on them as though it's their fault, but you're the one who's purchasing them for that purpose. And we still have that going on today. This book, once again, The Black Man's Religion. So this is something that bothered me. He talks about types of oppression that go on today and types of slavery that are happening today. And when this today was in the 90s. So this book should be updated, but the information is still pertinent. He talks about how they had child soldiers in Khartoum that they used as live blood banks. Just that phrase alone, it stirs me. They use them as live blood banks. So basically, they kept these children in case somebody gets injured. Then they would send these children to take their blood to donate to this injured soldier. It's just it's troublesome to think that slavery is over. And we are still so much. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on the past because it's important. I believe in Sankofa all day long. So go back and get it. But to focus only on the past while screaming I'm woke and neglecting what's going on right now here in America or across the globe is a form of hypocrisy and ignorance. I'm sorry. That's just what it is. He talks about, so here he's talking about in this same chapter, this is a rather lengthy chapter. He's talking about slaves, slaveholders, and Christ. This is a really good chapter because it talks about how Christianity operated within the black mind during and after slavery. Northern free blacks sending Christian literature down to the South, using the Bible for its abolitionist claims. Anybody who knows really about abolitionism, the abolitionist slavery, you will know that it started off as a Christian movement in Britain and then it spilled over here into the United States. So Christianity was a major force behind that. One of the earliest black abolitionists, David Walker, in 1829, he wrote a paper entitled The Appeal, wherein he argued that if European Americans were justified in taking up guns to fight off British oppression, let me just talk to you about that for a second. If European Americans were justified in picking up guns to fight off British oppression in the Revolutionary War, then African Americans should be justified to pick up guns. This is during slavery now, to pick up guns to fight off their oppression. And the two are not even the same. I think that point was such a valid point. The two are not even the same. The oppression that the Brits had on the colonies was taxation. Basically, the main complaint, the first thing that comes to mind is taxation. They weren't giving us the proper representation, but they were taking our money. They weren't slaves. They weren't being beaten. They weren't being raped. They might have had a soldier come in their house and take their things, without their consent, which I'm not saying that's not wrong, but it does not rise to the level of slavery. And so David Walker, a Christian abolitionist in the 1820s, and you can read his appeal online. It's downloadable in its original as a primary or secondary source in a newspaper article. So it says the American anti-slavery and reform movement were directly related to the evangelical movement of the early 19th century. Christianity and anti-slavery go hand in hand, despite the fact that we have the reverse set in our minds as American. The master class, so I often try to make this point, and this book does a good job of highlighting it. And just to give you an example, this is the book, right? You guys can see that. This is the book, the thickness of the book. This is the subject matter that you read in the book. All of this is the footnotes. All of this. All of this is reference material. So that tells you how heavily documented this book is. Okay, but the point I was making was, I kind of lost my train of thought, but that Christianity has always been a major portion of black thought, and that he said that a lot of Africans who were enslaved in the Americas, we heard the slave master's version of Christianity and we bypassed it. Like, we basically took it and made it our own and understood what Christianity was really supposed to be. I think I was about to read a quote. Let me go back to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so forget it. Sharp racial divisions are artificial categories, just as geographical boundaries are. As we discussed, it says here, Arabs neutered male African slaves to become eunuchs in prestigious households. And they also so Arabs not only enslaved Africans, but they also enslaved Europeans. And they would use the Europeans being of fairer skin as like a superior type, basically like house Negroes, right? As a superior type of servant, whereas they did use Africans to do field work, same as here in the United States, right? You have the lighter class, they say, was in the house, darker people on the fields. The Arabs did the same thing. It talks about, let's see, I think I went backwards. Yeah, that's what happened. I'm going to wrap it up soon, guys. It talks about slavery today, as I mentioned. And like I said, it gives you a lot of pointers to go and continue your research, do your research. Okay, so this is what I was going to read. The master class understood, I remember now. The master class understood, of course, that only a carefully censored version of Christianity could have its desired effect. Inappropriate biblical passages had been deleted. Sermons that might be proper for free men were not necessarily proper for slaves. So this is why they gave us a certain version of Christianity, and they so heavily supervised what slaves were teaching and preaching, such that you would have to have a lot of times the presence of a white person while you're preaching a sermon, just to make sure that you're not talking about deliverance. And they understood that the God of the Bible was a God of deliverance. So he goes into some detail about the resistance that European Americans had over giving Christianity to their slaves. They did not want their slaves to be Christian, because they understood that this would help them to identify themselves with the one true living God and lift themselves above a mentality of slavery. That often quoted verse, slaves obey your master, right? So if you go a few verses down, it says masters basically is giving the same command to the masters to have that same mutual respect for the slave. So they never told the slave about that verse. They stopped short. Hey, listen, slaves obey your master. But they never gave that injunction upon themselves that they should also respect their slaves. And so what does that do? What does that do if the Bible says servants obey your masters, masters respect your servants? That means that you're equal. And there's no way that they're going to allow the slaves to get their hands on a book that's going to tell them that they're equal. So you'll see memes floating around social media that say, how come your slave master going to give you a book that's going to be for your liberation when all they ever did was hurt you? That's right. You're absolutely right. That's why they resisted giving Christianity to us. And it was through missionary work, fighting and arguing against these slave masters, that they finally actually allowed us to get some redacted version of Christianity. And then when we started to learn how to read ourselves, we started to see what it was really about. But we always had that unction within us, knowing that something that they were telling us about God and about Jesus wasn't right. And so we understood in our own terms what Christianity truly was. I mean, like I said, this book, I could not put it down. The Christian faith became a driving force for abolition. We know that. All right, so Gabriel Prosser, he talks about, so I'm going to go into chapter 6, which is the final chapter. Militant Christianity, justice through reconciliation. So this book doesn't just leave you with, this is what has happened, this is what white people have done, this is what's going on. Okay, what's the solution? And he's saying that the solution is, I posted a video yesterday or the day before, accidental courtesy, I think. And it's about a man who is an African American who goes around talking to Klansmen in their full regalia. And what he wants to do, what he seeks to do, is have a conversation. And he feels that through these conversations, he is going to be able to show these people that what they think about black people isn't necessarily true. He doesn't go into it blindly believing that he's going to, I'm going to convert everybody. I'm going to make everybody believe black people. No, he understands that there's going to be some resistance, and that the results that he's going to yield are probably going to be few and far between, but he considers that worth it. And the documentary, it's on Netflix. Once again, it's called Accidental Courtesy, I think. They have these European Americans also interviewed, and they tell you, yeah, man, when I first started talking to him, I thought this, that, and the third about black people, but actually talking to him, I wound up realizing that I shouldn't be a part of the Klan. I shouldn't hold these ideologies because they're false. It's a false narrative that has been presented to me. And how, when I posted that, I got a lot of pull. I posted it in different groups. I got a lot of pullback from people saying like, no, man, that's dumb. Like you trusting your enemy, you playing the fool. You don't have to be playing the fool to have a conversation to try to educate the other person. That's a very Christian ideal. That's a very Christian perspective. Jesus sat down with sinners. Tell me something. If we don't talk to them, how are they supposed to get the message? What are they going to do? Watch TV? They're going to sit down and watch TV about these types of things, and it's going to miraculously appear to them. They're not inclined to go outside of their box. None of us are. None of us are inclined to search whether we're wrong unless God has given you that unction and you go ahead and act on it. But typically speaking, people don't just go ahead and see if their biases are misconceived. For one, a lot of times people don't even know that they're holding these biases. And so it takes another person sometimes, or a circumstance you wouldn't have previously been in, for somebody to come in and show you your true colors. And that's what this man is doing. He's going out and he's showing people why they're wrong. And he's extending them grace. Now, he's not doing it again. He's not doing it foolishly, I don't think, after having observed him. But it's a very Christian perspective. So what is the answer to racism? For one, what was the answer to slavery? It was Jesus. It was Jesus. I mean, I know that I'm going to sound like a fanatic, and people are going to say she's only saying that because she's a Christian. But the reality of the matter, white people did not just wake up one day and say, we're going to let these Negroes free. They fought and died to try to keep us on plantations. And we had Northerners who considered the Civil War a war of faith. It was a religious war to them. It was a religious war. God wants us to end this oppression that is taking place on this land, and I will fight to the death in the honor of what God is trying to do. It was Jesus who set people free off of these plantations. But yet people always say, well, where was Jesus? Where was Jesus during the 400 years? And they don't give him his due credit. And so what is it that's going to move us forward from here? Does oppression still exist? Absolutely. What is the answer? The answer is Jesus all day long. And so once again, I told you that one of the people in this book who wrote this book was a European American man who identifies politically. Remember, I told you it's a political social construct. He identifies socially as a black man. And he basically does the same thing the dude in that other documentary did. He goes out and he immerses himself in the black community. He said he found out the hard way that he had some racist ideals that he didn't know were there. He had some presuppositions about black people he didn't even realize he was presupposing. He didn't realize, because it's presupposed, you don't see it. It's just an inherent bias within you until something comes and checks it. And he went through that experience. And so, can a European American person be woke all day long? All day long, if they are willing to understand and accept the harsh realities of the hand that has been dealt to African Americans and how it continues to perpetuate itself today, why not? And so, people tend to say, well, racism will exist until Jesus comes again. And somebody, I think it might have been on one of Jamel Lashley's posts, I don't remember, but somebody posted saying, basically, that denies the power of the gospel. Can Christ turn nations around, Lord? Can he turn nations around? Did he not turn Nineveh around? Did not Jonah go and tell these people, y'all about to die, and if y'all don't repent? And what did they do? They repented. To the surprise of Jonah himself, they repented. To the surprise of Jonah himself, God granted them that forgiveness. And so that being said, does God have the power to I'm not going to say that racism and oppression will completely be obliterated, but can we change communities? Can we change neighborhoods? Absolutely. God says that if we repent of our sins and turn our face and seek him, he will respond. We draw near to him, he will draw near unto us. And that's not just on an individual basis, because when these individuals come together, one individual, one another, what does that make? That makes a community. And so can God change a community? Absolutely. So the answer to oppression, they say, is not ignoring it. The answer to oppression is recognizing it, calling it out, having these honest conversations, and bringing Jesus to the forefront. And when we submit ourselves fully to the Holy Spirit in recognition that he is anti-oppression, we will then recognize the oppression that we hold onto other people. This was one of the closing remarks that I thought was like, yo, this is some real deep stuff. He basically said, and it inspired one of my posts today about savagery, right? He basically said, if you've ever hated your brother, if you've ever lied to somebody, if you've ever cheated somebody, if you've ever taken advantage of any type of ignorance or position, you are an oppressor. Just think about that, man. Like, if I've taken advantage of your ignorance and done something against you, if I've lied to you, right, that means that you're waiting for me to give you the truth. You're dependent on me for the truth. Just speaking of what it means to lie. What it means to lie is, if somebody's accepting my lie, that means that they're assuming that what I'm saying is fact. So I am taking advantage of their ignorance in my statement and passing it off as fact. I've just oppressed that person. You too are an oppressor. We all can go through the same thing and experience the same hatred within us that the Germans started to feel against Jews when it was unfounded. We can feel the same oppression within us that European Americans felt against African Americans when it was unfounded. Given the opportunity, African Americans, some of us, would do the same things to them. And so what is the answer? The answer is not simply creating and passing laws that will supposedly end segregation or whatever the case may be, because we cannot legislate a change of heart. But what we can do is show love. And people are so afraid of showing love. And this is an argument that's made in this book. People are so afraid of showing love because they take it as a sign of weakness. Love is a sign of strength. It's a sign of strength to forgive you and love you despite your behavior towards me. Now, doesn't mean that I have to be a fool and let you keep pimping me and trying me. No, but what it does mean is that I understand the depravity of your nature, especially outside of Christ, and even within Christ. Sanctification is a process. We get born again, but once we're born again, we have to be built again. That nature, that human nature, is constantly going to be at battle, at variance with the spiritual mind, and so it's a struggle to allow Christ to change us. And if we know that as Christians, imagine the nation as a whole. You know what I'm saying? So once again, that is my review. I don't know if y'all have any questions, but man, like I said, I couldn't put this book down because I feel like it hit every note. It hit the note about what does it mean to be black. We're talking about the black man's religion. Can Christianity be Afrocentric? Can it? Yes, it can. But when we say, what does it mean to be black? How do you identify as a black person? Is it just by shade? Is it by nation? Is it by ideology? Is it by oppression? Once you determine that, what does it mean to be black historically? Were the ancient Egyptians black? Were the Israelites black? By our definitions, yes. By ancient definitions, no. No, they were not. And he also, like, again, he gives a warning against blackwashing history. Yes, we want to put our feet on the table, put our feet on the stand and say, listen, y'all have basically written us out of history, told the world that everything that was ever invented of value was invented by Europeans. We're starting to come into the realization that that's not true. But let's not go overboard and claim everything for ourselves. So this is just, again, all of this back section is footnotes and then a bibliography. So let me show you what this is a bibliography. Basically what books they use to write this book, man. This book, if you have any questions, ask me now because I'm about to let you guys go. But you need to buy this book. You need to buy this book if you're even remotely. And the book again was written by one African American and one European American, and they're saying that European Americans need to read it too. You need to understand the plight of the black man and how we have been treated historically and how we're being treated now and why people are having an uproar. He said that one thing that stood out in my mind in the book. They said that when African Americans were surveyed about their feelings of oppression, they post-slavery, European Americans took that as though these are sentiments that you're just now starting to have because it was just now coming to the European American attention. But these are things that we typically haven't been saying outside of our community. Like, for example, we hear stories on the news now of police officers planting evidence. We're hearing body cam footage of, I'm going to say this in the report. I'm going to say this is what happened when that didn't happen. We've been saying this for decades. We've been saying this all along, that this is what officers do. But when we say it, we look like we're complaining for no reason until it surfaces on the news and you have some fact behind it. Then, it was always fact, but you have some evidence behind it. Now it's starting to be accepted. But it's not a new phenomenon. Just because it's just now coming to the European American attention does not mean it's not been justified when we've said it all along. So this book is going to say some things that we've been saying all along and that need to come to the attention of other people who are not within our community. I would say that the underlying theme of this book is, yes, Christianity is a black man religion. No, everything in history wasn't black. What are we going to do from here? We need to move forward together and accept each other and correct each other in love. If y'all have any questions, inbox me. But once again, please buy this book. So I said that there was going to be a bonus. So there's a part 2 to the book. The part 2 of the book is Defending Black Faith by the same authors. And this time, instead of talking about just a general overview, again, this was written in the 90s. I'm trying to go to the table of contents. All right, so the titles of the chapters are, they say if you read the first book, then you could just skip to chapter 4. So I'm going to go from there. What do you say when Christians claim that all Christian doctrines begin in Africa? And then he talks about the whole Egypt horrors connection and disconnection or whatever. He talks about how do we answer to the Nation of Islam? How do we answer to Orthodox Muslim attacks on Christianity? How do we answer other challenges to Christianity? Are the Gospels really true? Why does it matter? Those are the chapters of this book, part 2. But reading these books, my birthday was last week, and I really want to thank you guys for the books that y'all bought me. I put out a list on Amazon, a birthday list of books, and so I'm going to go through them with you really quickly. I'm going to call this a preview. So I did the review, now I'm doing a preview. Blacks in Antiquity by Frank Snowden. And it talks about, it says it offers an effective way to expose the irrational in present-day attitudes is to recall the realities of the past. This is precisely what Frank Snowden has done in this book, a thoroughgoing, scholarly, beautifully illustrated study of the recorded contacts in the ancient world between the Greeks and the Romans and that mysterious race of dark-skinned Africans who they called Ethiopians. This is a very good book. It's got lots of images in it. Just a little taste for you. West African Christianity, the religious impact. I will call you out by name, those of you who bought the books, because I can't remember it, but I tried to leave the little notes in here. This is from Aki. Thank you, girl. Thank you. Some of y'all didn't even say nothing that y'all was buying, and I didn't find out until I got it. The Scandal of Ignatius. This is an ancient Christian historical account and some texts there that I asked for from birthday. Just to put you up on some books that I'm going to be reading. I've already started on Defending Black Faith. I'm writing a book also that is going to be somewhat similar to Defending Black Faith, but it's going to be for today. So these things were written in the 90s, but God's crime scene, this, because I do apologetics, but I don't just do urban apologetics. First of all, I think urban apologetics should be offered to everyone because everyone, once again, needs to know the truth, right? But I also do just general apologetics. Why is the Bible true in itself? This talks about why the Bible account is true from the natural perspective, the natural world, basically scientific, right? This is a cold case Christianity, a homicide detective's investigation to the claims of the gospel. Basically, he did an investigation the way he would have conducted homicide investigations. He investigated the gospels, and he was an atheist, as I understand it, or at least an agnostic before he did this investigation. And then through his investigation, he found that Christianity isn't more, the Bible rather, is more accurate or reliable than is promulgated by those who do not believe. And then race and slavery in the Middle East. So you might have noticed that I started doing some posts on Islam because that book spurred me to think about it more in detail. So I got these books. I also want to give a shout out to, oh my God, what's your name? Lance, I think his name is. I will tag you because I can't remember your name, but he sent me a lot of PDFs for my birthday as well, some of these books. So knowledge is power. All power to the people. If you have a question, please let me know. I'll be doing book reviews as I go along. Also, I wanted to let you guys know that a brother and I are coming out with an app, a Bible app that is also going to include apologetics questions. It's going to be like a quiz game that has basic questions about the Bible itself and then goes into detail about Christian history, biblical history, all of that. So I want you guys to lay around for that because that will be out really in the near future. Once again, that's an app that we're going to put out so that you guys can test yourself and develop your knowledge of these types of facts about the history of Christianity and Africa. All right, I love y'all. Bye-bye.